You know, asking the question, what can Dungeons and Dragons or tabletop games teach us about ourselves, is a real interesting one, because it feels so obvious and yet incredibly vague at the same time. Like, of course we can learn about ourselves from D&D. I mean, we literally put a part of ourselves into every character we make, and then those characters create bonds and go through trauma, and we get to explore how those parts of ourselves might react. But at the same time, I feel the stuff we do learn about ourselves can be very small, or go missed until long after a campaign has ended and we have time to reflect back on it and realize just the sort of things that we subconsciously realized while playing. But that being said, it really doesn't remove the fact that a tabletop game often requires us to put ourselves in the shoes of a character in a different world, dealing with things we just wouldn't have to in a day-to-day life. Betrayal, conquest, love, loss, all things we will experience in our lives, sure, but as a D&D character, we often get to explore those things in quick succession and truly learn more about ourselves in the process. After all, we never learn more about ourselves than when in trial by fire, and let's be fair, our D&D characters go trial by fire way more often. That's what makes a good story. So, I want to talk about the lessons we can learn about ourselves when we step into a campaign with close friends. I want to talk about just what we learn about ourselves when we play Dungeons and Dragons. So let's talk about that. Now, before talking about what we can learn about ourselves from Dungeons and Dragons, there's a required explanation of why we learn anything from ourselves at all in D&D and tabletop games. I touched on this a little bit in the intro, but when we play D&D, we are required to create a character who we must step into the shoes of in order to determine who they are, what actions they will take, and most importantly, why they will take those actions. After all, there's not really any getting around the fact that this is a role-playing game, and the definition of roleplay, from Google anyways, is to act out or perform the part of a person or character, for example as a technique in training or psychotherapy. So, clearly, in order to roleplay, we have to perform the part of this character, and in order to do that, we first have to understand the character. So to put this in a frame of reference, as humans we cannot naturally understand other points of view without points of reference from which we first understand. It's basically the fundamental way our brains work. If we cannot recognize something by comparing it to an experience we are familiar with, we do not know how to handle or comprehend it, and so ordinarily when this happens, our brains will outright reject it or have no idea how to handle it, thus leaving us with no visceral or strong reaction to it. So, if that is how our brains work, in order to put ourselves in the role of a character who is not us, we must first choose a frame of reference we are familiar with to at least begin building who this said character is. Thus, no matter how hard we try, every player character we create will in some part have some pieces of us inside of them. And I'm very aware this isn't a new concept either. Tons of people understand that any character they create is going to have a little piece of them. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that there are a lot of people who only create characters because they know it will all have a little piece of them. The reason I'm addressing this is to bring light to the fact that there really is no way to escape the reality that our characters represent a part of ourselves that we found desirable enough to explore in a roleplay game with a group of people. So when your character goes through something traumatic, something heroic, or something heartbreaking, and you sit there after session thinking, what is my character's reaction going to be to this? In some small part, you are also going to be asking yourself, if I were to go through this, what would this part of myself feel and how would it react? And you know, that's part of the beauty of tabletop roleplay. Putting yourself in a vulnerable space and asking others around the table to do the same so you can all explore aspects of yourselves and them in situations you ordinarily wouldn't be able to. And yeah, I get it. Jay is talking about being vulnerable at the table again. Everyone take a shot. I know I talk about it a lot. But hey, it's what I find important and interesting to discuss. But with the understanding that that is inherently what tabletop roleplay is, people exploring aspects of themselves in a vulnerable space, we get to really bite into the meat of the video. What can we learn about ourselves from this? I think there's a few different things we can really dive into here. The first is looking at what aspect of ourselves we've chosen to put into our characters. For a sort of frame of reference, I'll be speaking on one of my characters I've played to completion, at least in the terms of a character arc, as a sort of example to base things on. And that character was a dragonborn gunslinger named D'Artagnan. Now, D'Artagnan was a real rascal and a bastard. I mean the worst kind of person. He was a total drunkard, a snarky potty mouth, and about as manipulative as one could be when the party first met him. In fact, the only reason they really kept him around is because he was manipulative enough to convince them that he was their best chance at getting through an important mission, since he had the know-how to track down a group of refugees they were trying to save. And even that might not have been enough. They had also signed a contract with the people who were supporting their mission that kind of said that they all had to stick together for a certain time. So that was also something that saved him. But he really wasn't a pleasant person to be around. When I first played him, I really didn't know why he was quite literally about as far from my personality as one could get. And yet I couldn't help consistently relating with him, and eventually I realized that there was a part of me I had based him off of. and that was my intense need to project a superior intellect in order to hide my insecurities, while simultaneously sabotaging myself, so I could claim that any failures I had were not due to my failure to be as smart as I claimed, but because I had other shit going on. Man, I am really putting myself on blast for this one, huh? So, while in real life I would project intelligence but then sabotage myself by either making myself too busy or intentionally not starting a task until it was too late so that I could claim it was those factors, and not my lack of understanding, that caused me to fail a task, D'Artagnan would mirror this behavior by having his highest intelligence possible in-game without magic, but yet consistently failing his roles and looking like an idiot because he had a bottle of the good stuff in his hand and a flask on his hips at all times. Basically, he was the embodiment of my narcissism, although I didn't realize it at the time. And I'm really not ashamed to admit that, because it was playing this character that helped me realize that was a problem I in fact had in the first place. So, by identifying what aspect of myself I put into my character, already one can learn amazing things about themselves by realizing it's a part of them they may have not understood or even realized was there in the first place. The next reason I think D&D can teach us incredible things about ourselves is because when you play a tabletop game, your character will be put in a multitude of situations, both good and bad. And this does a few things. 1. It allows you to see how you might react in a situation you've never been in before. Back to D'Artagnan real quick, there was a point in the campaign where he was faced with the realization that one of the people they were sent to rescue was most likely his real-blood father who had abandoned him when he was a child. He had never searched for him before and had absolutely no frame of reference for why he had even been put up for adoption in the first place. And that was an interesting thing for me to grapple with, as I have never been in such a situation. In fact, my parents did and still do love me very much and remain an important part in my life, which I am incredibly grateful for because I know that many people don't get to have that. But it was this moment that helped me realize that fact and how lucky I was. Ultimately, D'Artagnan all but essentially confirmed that this man was his real father, and after speaking with him, he chose to walk away without ever telling him the truth about who he was. That was a tough decision for that character, and it was a situation where I myself had to ask if this part of me would react that way. Would the narcissism that I put into this character want to give this man in front of him closure on what happened to the child he abandoned so long ago and let him know that he was doing well? Ultimately, D'Artagnan, and by extension that part of me, chose to say this NPC did not deserve closure. I had no idea how to react, but I learned something about that piece of me that day, and that's eternally valuable. So, when you're playing your character and you're faced with those decisions, you get to decide how you feel about them and determine how that part of you reacts. And by doing so, you learn more about yourself and the underlying emotions you get to experience in situations you might never actually be in. That's incredible. And those decisions and situations begin adding up and can ultimately lead to the third thing I think tabletop games can teach us about ourselves, as they lead to the ultimate arc of your character. Every decision, every situation, every lesson your character learns leads them in a certain direction. The culmination of these decisions and that direction at the end of the campaign can often be described as the end of your arc, where your character started, what they learned, and where they are now. Now, to be clear, a character arc is not always positive. In fact, there are negative and positive character arcs. There are even stable or neutral character arcs in which your character does not grow or change, but instead changes those around them. Either way, every fleshed out character has an arc, and each of these decisions you make on what that part of you will do in those situations leads to the ultimate conclusion of where your character arc is going. Is your character going to overcome their greatest fear? Are they going to succumb to their greatest vices? Will they rise up and embrace their true power? The truth is, each conclusion of a character arc does more than show us what we want, so long as we find that conclusion satisfying. If a character you're playing falls into darkness and ultimately pays for their hubris through a dramatic death, but you find that satisfying, that tells you something about you. Perhaps that part of you is one you'd like to see die, or maybe you often think about embracing that part of you and D&D lets you explore that fantasy just once. On the flip side, if your character overcame a fear of cowardice and rose up to be a hero and you find that satisfying, it's likely you have something in your own life you'd like to rise against. But the truth is, I'm not a trained psychologist. At the end of the day, I can't tell you what these things mean about yourself. But you, in experiencing them and figuring out how you feel about it, can begin to learn about yourself in that way, and I think that's truly fascinating. And going even beyond that, D&D lets you feel what that's like and might give you the encouragement to be able to face those things or learn about them. Ultimately, that's what D&D can teach us. Parts of who we are that we didn't realize, things we didn't know we wanted, a future we think we might want to grasp. It lets us explore emotions, vulnerabilities, and situations we ordinarily wouldn't in day-to-day life to better understand what it is we want and where we're going. At the end of the day, my true belief is that a good tabletop game is about exploring who you are, seeing who you could be, and determining who you want to be. It's about realizing portions of yourselves you didn't know were there and deciding if you'd like those portions to change. It's about admiring your strengths and identifying your weaknesses, and doing so at a table of many others doing the same so that all of you can create an amazing story that you all find satisfying. Ultimately, D'Artagnan did not make it all the way through the levels 3 through 17 campaign that we ran. In fact, he left somewhere around just over the halfway point. But I found his character arc incredibly satisfying. I identified that he had the narcissism that I did, and I didn't like that. And over the course of the campaign, he was confronted with it, and ultimately, he decided that he did not have to be in the spotlight, and he did not have to be as intelligent as he made himself out to be. At the end of the day, he determined that it was not necessary to be that smart, but instead all he had to do was lean into what he was actually good at. So, as the artificer at the table, he left the campaign. He went home, and he decided to continue making items to support the party while being with his family. Not the ones who had left him to be adopted, but the ones who had adopted and loved him. And that helped me realize what I wanted to do about my narcissism. I didn't want to pretend to be smart. I think I have plenty of great strengths, and I think I'm pretty smart, but I'm not as smart as I was pretending to be, and that's okay. Instead, I would rather lean into the talents that I do have and start doing what I love. Without being able to explore that in D&D, I don't think I would have ever come to that conclusion, and I've seen plenty of my players do the same thing where they found out something about themselves because of their character and started making positive changes in their lives. So is D&D some sort of amazing therapy session? It's not therapy. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It is never a replacement for therapy. But what it is an amazing opportunity to explore parts of yourselves. And that can be therapeutic. And even better, it can be a whole lot of fun when you do it with a bunch of people who you care about and like laughing at a table with you. So, go out into the world and make it your own, you beautiful bastards. Don't forget to have a great day and never forget to play your role. Thank you. Come again.